understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How are you doing there? Hope all is well. It is time for the podcast. And this podcast is going to be on the possibility, not the probability, but the possibility of sanctions against Israel on the basis that if this war continues to go on and if the Israelis continue to kill civilians with impunity, eventually, public opinion, which is already shifting, will shift. And it's not saying this is likely to happen in an imminent way, but what would happen if the European Union decided to sanction Israel? It's economics of sanctions. We're going to be talking about that in a couple of minutes. But first, John, you were in London this week.
I was in London, and I have to say, sorry, I'm just reading the paper here, just going through some of the reviews. But I was in London last week at a conference, anti-money laundering conference, actually.
Which we're going to talk about in a second.
Yeah, it was fascinating stuff. But walking down Piccadilly, which is gorgeous, busy, bustling London, which I really miss, actually. And there in the window of Waterstones is money. Story of humanity.
It's everywhere.
And the only reason I'm mentioning this is I'm not blowing smoke up your hole, as they say. But
the hole is open to smoke being blown.
Jesus. Anyway, but the reviews are fantastic. Still, you're still a month on at number one in Ireland.
In the Irish, in the non-fiction.
Yeah, Amazon, you're still riding high. But this is the good one. You've had the FT, but The Economist.
Oh,
fantastic review in The Economist. And let me just read. I just want to read some of this.
By the way, I've paid him happily to do this. The check is in the post.
Money is fascinating, but reading about money can be mind-numbingly dull. That is certainly not the description that can be applied to Money, a new book by David McWilliams. Do not be put off by the fact that the author was a former central banker. This is no dry tome on monetary theory. Instead, it is a whistle-stop tour through human history with money and its engineers as the central characters.
Yeah, I know. I saw that. That was great. Look, The Economist, it's brilliant to get these sort of reviews. As you said, on Amazon, it's, I think, number 3, which is great in the sort of business and economic history.
And you're off to Scotland.
I'm off to Scotland. Actually, that's what we wanted to get to. So the BBC have chosen the book to be the book of the week, which is a massive BBC Radio 4. Yeah. It's a really nice.
I actually listen to it most nights.
Yeah. So book of the week is people who listen to BBC Radio 4 will know they pick a fiction, usually a fiction book of the week or a non-fiction book. And what they do then, the Beeb read the book and they then cut it up into bits. What they feel is most appropriate.
Yeah, that'll be interesting actually to see how they edit it.
What they take, and then it'll be book of the week. I think it's in November, but I have got to go to Scotland to read this to BBC Glasgow. And actually, when I said I haven't been to Glasgow for years, I really don't know Glasgow at all. Despite the fact that my grandparents actually came from Glasgow, and they actually came from Uist, which is really, really far up. My great grandparents. But I don't really know it very well. So actually, if we have any Ouija's out there, our Glaswegian podcast fans, I probably would love to either meet you or maybe you can just on Twitter or maybe on Insta, just give us a few options what to do in Glasgow for 48 hours.
You might even buy a pint.
I might buy a rake of pints. No, we could do, or maybe do something maybe book related. I'm not too sure. But I was also this morning, John, before you rocked up here, on Loganair. Loganair is the Scottish...
Roy Logan.
Yeah. Logan Roy. Exactly.
Logan Roy.
Kendall Roy Air. But Logan Roy. Because they fly all around Scotland to the islands. And there is a direct flight from Glasgow to an island called Barra.
Oh, I know it. A very good friend of mine is from Barra.
No way.
And they land on the beach.
They land on the beach, right? And Barra is the island just to the south of South Uist, which is where my grandparents are from.
Right.
So actually might even go there.
Yeah.
And on Saturday, take that flight to Barra and maybe get the ferry up to Uist and just potter around for a couple of days.
That would be fantastic.
Yeah, it's really far.
Bring a raincoat.
It's the Outer Hebrides.
Yeah,
Outer Hebrides. So it's a long...
I was supposed to go to a wedding there, actually.
No way.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, I couldn't make it. I just couldn't make it work at the time.
Like, it's a long
David
way away.
Lindsay, yeah.
It's a long, long way away. So, and if anybody knows that part of the Hebrides and you're listening to the Dave McWilliams podcast, John and I, give us a shout on Twitter or else on Instagram and give us a few pointers. Anyway, apart from books and Scotland and the BBC, you were trying to launder money this week.
I was. I went to London to a conference, a financial crime and anti-money laundering conference.
This is to find out yourself. This is for your Bitcoin investments, is it?
Exactly. But it was fascinating. And it was full of really interesting people. You know, the chief of the IRS crime investigations was there.
The US guys?
Yes.
Why?
Yeah.
Okay.
And the president of FATF and all of it. Anyway, I was there to do a bit of research on something else I'm doing. But
we should actually do a podcast on money laundering.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
Well, it's interesting. Like, you know, just this week, TD Bank, Toronto Dominion Bank.
Huge Canadian bank, yeah.
Yeah. Have just been fined $3 billion for money laundering or for facilitating money laundering from, you know, fentanyl trades, the whole lot. And I'm not going to get into it because I don't have all the details of it, but just get your head around this one figure. 18.3 trillion. That is the amount of money that flowed through the bank between 2018 and 2024.
Wow.
And the interesting thing about it was when I was thinking about this, I was gobsmacked. But your book, back to the book, you know, one of the recurring themes in the book about money is trust and faith in money itself, but trust in the financial system.
Yeah.
And, you know, when you have one of the biggest banks in North America.
Yeah, and it's a huge bank.
It really does call into question.
I'm going to give you something really fascinating on this. So obviously what gels the finance system together is this notion of trust, because that's where people willingly trade with each other. Then there's also this notion between high trust and low trust societies. Okay. And high trust societies are obviously societies where there's a huge amount of goodwill towards each other. There's a huge amount of trust. There's a huge amount of reputational capital. That's and low trust society. So the amazing, and this is the fascinating about Canada, and this is maybe why this happened in the Toronto Dominion Bank. Canada is one of the highest trust societies in the world. And I even know this. So, for example, when I go and do these speeches around, you know, I do a lot.
Yeah, you do a lot of it in Canada.
And I do a lot in Canada, right? And Canada is very, very high trust society, so they pay you straight away. But, and this is the fascinating thing, Canada is also one of the countries where the most outrageous scams and frauds appear. Now, why is this, right? So you contrast Canada, let's say, with Nigeria, which is a very low trust society, right? Nigeria is, we all say, the home of the great fraud. But interestingly, very few frauds occur in Nigeria. Why? Because people don't trust each other.
Right.
So, you know, if you said, if you
I see what you mean.
I'm a Nigerian prince, right? The Nigerians just laugh at that.
Yeah.
In Canada, because people trust each other, fraudsters can get away with enormous things in Canada. It's easier to actually pull the wool over a Canadian's eyes than almost any other nation in the world because they trust each other.
Yeah.
And so back to your Toronto Dominion, like why Toronto Dominion Bank? Given all the banks in North America. And I think it could be the fact that the very high trust society is counterintuitively the mecca for the scam merchant.
Yeah.
Because they don't expect to be scammed. And the Canadians don't expect to be scammed because...
Is that naivety?
You can't do that, eh? You know, the Canadians, eh? Right? You can't do that, eh? Because it's kind of a naivety, but it's a beautiful naivety.
Yes.
It's a naivety born of years of good experience.
Yeah.
So it's only naive when you're faced with a criminal. And that's a really nice way of looking at the world. And that might explain why it's the Canadians.
I wonder is that... I'm talking off the top of my head here. I'm getting all...
Jesus, I've been doing that for years.
But I wonder, is it because Canada is one of those countries, like it's a huge open frontier country. And in frontier countries, a bit like Norway is a huge high trust country as well, is that the only way to survive in a country like that, Norway, Canada, is to rely on each other. And trust
Maybe.
is,
Could well be. I think in the Canadian case, it could be exactly that it's sparsely populated with enormous jeopardy all the time. If you imagine a settler country to be, I'm not too sure we can explore. Canadian listeners, can you explain to us why Canada is such a high trust society? And then can you also accept that the downside of a high trust society is that it is a criminal's mecca? If the criminal can actually get in there.
Is a prince from Nigeria.
There's a prince from Nigeria.
I don't know. I mean, it wasn't just one particular fraud. It was a whole series that went for years. It was just bad compliance.
Compliance. But again, compliance is a function of experience. So if you have been scammed, you are going to have much more aggressive, precise, and exacting compliance standards. If you've never been scammed, you'll have much more lax compliance standards. And that's where the criminals went in to the Canadians and shafted them. Yeah. That's what I think is going on.
Yeah, and do you know what? The other really interesting thing I learned at this conference was the fact that, do you know how many sanctions have been implemented since 2022, beginning of the Ukraine war? Take a wild guess.
No idea. No, you mean so the individual...
It counts for the country, the individuals, products, companies.
Okay, no, I had no idea.
47,000.
Oh my God.
And growing. I think it was something like 54,000 this year alone.
Wow.
And the thing about it is that when you are trading with somebody or transferring money or buying a product or whatever, it has to go through that filter of 47,000 sanctions to make sure that you're compliant.
Well, listen, we're going to talk about sanctions on Israel.
Yes.
Let's come back and talk about sanctions on Israel after the break.
So, Mike, we were just talking there about sanctions and sanctions on Russia since the beginning of the war in Ukraine. And they were sanctioned because they were the aggressor nation. But it seems like in the Middle East that, Israel is the aggressor nation. So, should Israel be sanctioned? Because it doesn't seem like there's there doesn't seem to be much of a end in sight. So if sanctions were applied, perhaps that might put some pressure on. But if they were, what would you sanction in Israel?
It's a very interesting question, right? It's a question that the Israelis understandably do not want to be even discussed internationally. Its great nemesis in the region, Iran, has been under sanctions for years.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And a lot of people say, well, hold on a second. At a certain stage, somebody is going to have to bring certain pressure to bear on Israel to stop killing people. Okay, very simply, stop killing children, civilians, etc., which it's doing with impunity. And the question is, at a certain stage, do sanctions become part of the issue? Now, there's a whole big movement called BDS, which is called boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel. Yeah. And that is a movement on largely the left of the spectrum, very extreme movement. What I think we should discuss is the notion of more mainstream sanctions on Israel. Now, the question then is, what is the Israeli economy, right? If we get to that stage, right? And I think that what I'm not saying here in the podcast is this will happen. What I'm not saying is it should happen. What I'm saying is it could happen because of the way in which wars progress and positions shift.
Would it have a major impact on Israel? Okay,
so let's go back. So, John, as you know, because you and I were living in London at the time, and then I ended up taking a job. It's funny, my boss in UBS came in just in 1994 and said, basically, does anyone want to go to Israel to be the Israeli economist of the bank? There's a team of us.
Cool.
And I said, I'll go. So I found myself...
Ship him out. Get rid of that fella.
So it was during the Oslo, it was during that extraordinary time of optimism in the Middle East, just after the Oslo Accords.
Oh yeah, of course.
So there was a perception that there's going to be peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis. There's going to be a two-state solution. That two-state solution is going to cause a huge amount of money to flow into the region that is now Israel, but Israel and Palestine. And of course, there would be trade deals with Jordan, there'll be trade deals with Syria, there'll be trade deals with Egypt, there will be peace in the region, and there will be a new flourishing. And of course, then UBS, the bank I worked for, was a big Swiss bank. So they opened an office in Tel Aviv, not having had an office there before. They had a presence, but not an office. And also money had rarely come into Israel in the typical way in which it comes into economies. And also the fact, John, that do you remember I'd gone to Russia to learn Russian a couple of years before that? And there was a hell of a lot of Russian money in Israel, which had moved from Russia to Israel. So there was a sort of an idea, like, David, you go over there. And
this is the kind of supposedly the new dawning of the Middle East.
The new dawning of the Middle East. And it was a very optimistic period. It's so difficult now to imagine that when I arrived in Israel, the Green Line, which was defining the 1967 borders between Israel and the West Bank, you could travel freely, back and forth, Palestinians, Israeli, all the time, no checkpoints, nothing.
Yeah.
It's really quite amazing. And when I say no checkpoints, there were Israeli soldiers in the West Bank, no doubt.
Yeah.
But there was, hundreds of thousands, or there were tens of thousands of people traveling back and forth every day. And I found myself meeting with Israeli policymakers, Israeli economists, Israeli commentators, Israeli industrialists. And my job was to explain to the bank and to the bank's investors what was happening in the Israeli economy, how it worked, how it didn't work, what was the likely growth path of the economy, but also what was the likely growth path of the new West Bank economy.
Were there any Arab Israelis in that group?
Lots.
Okay.
Lots. So that's the first time I met what they call Arab Israelis. They themselves call themselves Palestinians. The Israelis call them Arab Israelis.
Right, yeah.
But there were, when I say lots, there was preponderance were obviously Jewish Israelis. But there were a lot of people with Arabic names who were Israeli citizens who spoke Arabic at home. And they were the Palestinians. They're the 2 million people, the 2 million citizens now of Israel who are Arabs.
Right.
And who are Palestinians. The 2 out of the 7 million population. And of course, the office was in Tel Aviv. A lot of people stayed in Jerusalem. A lot of foreigners stayed in a compound around a thing called the American Colony Hotel, which was very, very swanky. And I decided, no, if I'm going to try to understand this country, I'm going to go and live in or take a flat in an area that was full of Israelis. Yeah. And I took a flat in a very unfashionable part of Tel Aviv called Ramat Gan. Right. Ramat Gan was then a predominantly Iraqi Jewish area.
Yeah.
Predominantly. Yeah. If people know that area, it's defined by a massive big tower called the Diamond Tower. And again, I probably got a very decent insight. So on the one hand, your job was going to actually analyze the economy. So traveling around the country, looking at big manufacturing sites, but also looking at the data, looking at the exchange rate, talking to the Bank of Israel, talking to commentators, all that stuff, which is where I met people like Pinchas Landau years ago.
Yes,
old friends of mine, right?
Yeah.
But I probably learned more about the psychology of the nation in the evenings, having chats with my neighbors. And my neighbors were all...
Were they good English speakers?
Pretty good. Fascinatingly, these were all Iraqi Jews. So the grandparents who had been kicked out of Iraq would have spoken Arabic together.
Right.
And then their kids and their grandkids, they all lived in, and because they're very traditional, they kind of live on top of each other in kind of big families. And then I got a sense, these were second and third generation refugees themselves. So they're refugees themselves. So they were kicked out in 1948. Overnight almost. So they became a wave of refugees into Israel. I think there's about 800,000 who were kicked out of the Arabic countries. Jews who lived there for centuries, actually Jews who lived there for thousands of years.
Yeah.
And sitting talking to them probably gave me a sense of their worldview, definitely paranoid, definitely traumatized. I think pop psychologists have this expression, which is hurt people hurt.
Right, okay.
That, if you are damaged, the chances of you kicking out against somebody else are really quite high.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking that, I was a young guy, but you're sitting around chatting to them, and you're obviously...
It was not victims of victims phrase.
Exactly, which is the phrase that Edward Said used to me when I interviewed him. But the interesting thing is, I did economics then in the same way as I do it now. which is like a little bit of testimony, a little bit of storytelling, and then add the numbers and then add the stories to give you a sense of what's happening to the people. So
Yeah.
it would
Give us some of the numbers then.
So the first thing that really struck me was that the Israeli economy then was beginning to transform itself from a very inward-looking, very socialist, incredibly socialist economy run by an outfit called Histadrut. The Histadrut are the big trade union movement, right?
Okay, yeah.
Moving from that to the economy the Israelis have now, which is a high-tech, high-finance trading machine, in effect, right? And of course, the key catalyst to change was the arrival of those Russian engineers who came from Russia in 1990. And they constituted basically the sort of intellectual raw material of the Israeli high-tech industry, which was well articulated in that book beside you there, Startup Nation.
Yeah. I mean, you're actually quoted loads in this, actually. What year is this book?
This is a book written in 2007 by Saul Singer and Dan Senior called Startup Nation.
The story of Israel's economic miracle.
Yeah. So I spoke to them a lot. They interviewed me a lot about this. So yeah, I was really involved in thinking about this economy for a long, long time. Anyway, what really struck me was in the course of my research was just how dependent Israel is on Europe. So when I started drilling deep into the Israeli trade statistics, financial flows, etc., what struck me was that although everyone talks about the special relationship between America and Israel on the military hardware side, the actual nuts and bolts of the Israeli economy are European. So everyone says America is Israel's protector. But what they don't really realize is actually Europe is Israel's bread and butter, right? And that's the interesting thing. And of course, this makes complete sense that a country like Israel, which has had to turn away from its Arab neighbors in every way, so they're not going to trade with them, right? Is going to trade with the big bloc beside them. And obviously, remember, I've always said that economics is geography.
Yeah.
That when you're close to somebody, that determines your trade and your investment flows, which is something the Brexiteers forgot in England.
Yes.
They said, we're going to leave Europe. But I said, oh, shit, we do all their trade with Europe, right? The same with the Israelis. So the Israelis do this enormous amount of trade. I'll give you the figures with the European Union, right? So the EU is by far Israel's largest trading partner. It accounts for 28.8% of all Israeli trade in goods, right?
Okay.
That's almost double its trade with the US, which is the second largest. So about 28% of total trade in goods from Israel is with the European Union, right? About 15% is with the United States. So Europe is twice as big in Israeli economics than the United States. People don't really seem to accept that, right?
Yeah.
31.9% of all Israel's imports come from the EU.
Right.
It's a huge figure. And 24% of all the country's exports are bought in the EU. The United States, by way of contrast, only 9% of Israel's imports come from the United States. That's
mostly military hardware and
military
stuff.
hardware in the main, not just military, but lots of stuff, but lots of military. In contrast, about a quarter of their exports go to the US. So they export a lot to the US, but in fact, they import very, very little. Whereas with the European Union, it's much more normal, the patterns of trade. Big imports, big exports. So, but the contrast is, so whereas the European Union is by far and away the biggest player in Israeli trade, Israel, because it's so small, is only a minnow in European trade. So Europe only does 0.8% of its total trade with Israel.
Right, okay.
So there's a massive asymmetry between the power of Europe economically in Israel and the complete absence of Israeli power vis-a-vis Europe the other way around, right? Now, that very asymmetry is Israel's Achilles heel. So, John, just to give you a sense, in 2022, European-Israeli trade was about 50 billion, right? Which is very small for Europe, but very big for Israel. Just by way of thinking, the figures from the Israeli embassy in Dublin show that Ireland and Israel last year, 2023-24, did 4 billion of trade together. That's a big figure.
Wow.
It's a big figure, right?
So, what's the balance on that?
The balance on that is about 50-50, and it's a lot to
Right,
do with
Jesus.
so it's a lot to do with the multinationals trading with themselves. So in
Intel and the like.
all that sort of thing, Intel and Google and all these things. But I mean, there's also, we export a huge amount of audio equipment to Israel.
Right. As in this podcast.
As in this podcast, well, after this one, I'm not sure after this one, right? No, but audio equipment, and you just think, what sort of audio equipment are we exporting to Israel? Who's listening? You know, I'm being very serious, right?
Yeah.
Okay, because Irish people go, oh my God, we should do this, that. And I say, well, look at the statistics, look at the figures. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on here at a very deep level. But in international commerce, size matters, right? So basically, the big guys are the rule makers and the small guys are the rule takers. So that's always the way.
Yeah.
And so when I hear Israeli right-wing nationalist politicians slagging the EU, saying the EU is ineffectual, it's in together with the United Nations, Israeli industrialists must wince when they hear this, because Israeli industrialists know how important Europe is. And if your politicians are slagging off Europe all the time, maybe you're thinking, hold your horses a wee bit. So Willy Brandt, the German chancellor, described Germany as a political pygmy, but an economic giant. And in a way, it's a similar explanation for Europe in Israel. The Israelis see Europe as a political pygmy, can't do anything, but it's an economic giant in Israel's day-to-day economy. And if that giant decided to switch off trade, it would stop the Israeli economy in its tracks in a day, right?
Yeah.
Or very, very quickly. And that kind of brings you to the idea of sanctions, right? Because when you look at the numbers and you look at the asymmetry and you look at the extraordinary power of Europe in the Israeli economy, you think, okay, what happens down the road if this war continues on and European public opinion continues the way it's going? Do the Israelis become like the Serbs in 1992, where they are sanctioned for their attacks on the Bosnians?
Yeah.
Do they become like the Russians in 2022, where they are attacked? Or do they become like the original kind of sanctions with the South Africans? Do they become like the South Africans in the 70s and 80s, where they are sanctioned?
Yeah.
This is not beyond the possibilities of basic mainstream political and economic analysis, right?
Wasn't it Macron who said during the week that, France will not stand for a Gaza-type levelling of Lebanon?
Precisely. And France has always been very close to Lebanon, right? In fact, most Lebanese Christians speak French as their default language, not English. So what I would say is that if the Israelis continue to do to Lebanon what they did in Gaza, European public opinion will change. There's no doubt in my mind, right?
Yeah, it's already changing, as you say.
And of course, you see, if you look at the Serbs, and again, these are a race I know, and I've been down to Belgrade a lot of times and know them, even the white South Africans are, of course, the Russians. The country that is sanctioned always says, we are the victims. You don't understand us. You can't understand the nuance of what's going on here. We are misunderstood, right? It's kind of whataboutery. What about those guys? What do they do, right?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, what people see is they see Serb soldiers killing civilians.
Yeah.
They see Russian soldiers killing civilians. They see white South Africans killing black people in Soweto. And they see Israeli soldiers and Air Force killing civilians. That's what we see, right?
Yeah.
And eventually things might tip. Like, just to be clear, I don't think these are imminent, right? But it certainly has to be at the table. And one thing is really interesting is sanctions work really well when the majority of people in the society benefit from the openness of the economy. That's why they didn't work very well against the Serbs, because most Serbs in former Yugoslavia were too poor to buy Fords and Fiats and, the things that were sanctioned against them, right? So that didn't matter to them. The vast majority of Russians are too poor to be affected by sanctions. They're not buying luxury goods. They're not buying Teslas, right? So therefore, sanctions don't work because it's only the elite become really, really affected by sanctions. The average person isn't affected at all. The elite always figure out a way of sanction busting, getting their stuff, right? And so sanctions can go on for a long time. Whereas in South Africa, the vast majority of the white middle class were middle class and supporters of apartheid. And they were affected profoundly psychologically by not being able to play sport, by not being able to travel, by not being able to get their money in and out of the country, by not being able to buy high quality, high status, foreign goods, all that. They are much more like the Israelis in composition, right? And that's why I think sanctions could work quite quickly against Israel, if that were to come to pass. The other thing is, of course, Europe is very divided. You see, France is now beginning to make these moves. Spain is very, very pro-Palestinian. Ireland is very pro-Palestinian. But we're an outlier.
Yeah.
Ireland is an outlier. There's no point thinking that what is said on the streets of Ireland is reflective of the mood in Europe, because it's not. I mean, the data just doesn't look at it. But gradually, bit by bit, if this war continues and if the slaughter of innocents continues, the European public opinion will absolutely change. So right now, European capitals are dictated by a realpolitik. One is Israel has been our traditional ally? Yes. Two, and there's a real cynicism here, are the Israelis doing the job that Europeans might like to be done to fundamentalist Islam? Yes. Do Europeans want to be in bed with Iran? No. So on these kind of black and white things, and of course, Germany has, we don't need to expand on it here, has a Holocaust problem.
Yeah.
Germany cannot go against a Jewish state.
But, your number 2 point there about taking on fundamentalist Islam, they're creating that, and it's making it more entrenched in the region.
I agree with you, but there's obviously people at European capitals who believe this.
Right,
I really think so.
Yeah.
They believe the Netanyahu idea that we are standing up for democracy and Western values and all this nonsense, right?
Bullshit, yeah.
It is bullshit. But there must be, because the chasm between the European street, i.e. the people, and the European, almost what you could describe as palace. Right? When I use the European palace, I mean all the European parliaments and all this, is really quite significant. But what happens, for example, if the Israelis decide to attack willingly or unwillingly, mistakenly or intentionally, European UN observers in South Lebanon? I mean, if they really attack them, what happens then to public opinion? And this is all happening. This is not like pie in the sky thinking. So I think that at the moment, European officialdom is still squarely behind Tel Aviv / Jerusalem. But I think it can change. I'll give you an example. There is a massive difference between the generations, right?
Yeah.
Older Europeans see Israel and frame Israel as the David and Goliath story. Small little Jewish state created after the Holocaust, for which Europeans have a massive, massive, not just responsibility, but guilt complex about, needs to be defended.
Yeah.
Right? And is surrounded by hundreds of millions of enemies. Gen Z doesn't see it that way at all. For example, in France, only 32% of voters under the age of 35 look upon Israel favorably. Right? That means 70% don't, right?
Yeah.
And in contrast, 57% over 65 look on Israel favorably. So there's a massive generation gap. So I think, what we should do here is examine the fact that in conflicts, eventually a conflict tends to come to the end when a bigger player comes in and applies pressure on the smaller player. Normally that's America. But if you could imagine if the Europeans decided to sanction Israel, given the extraordinary impact this would have on Israel and the negligible impact it would have on Europe, it would be a very easy sell in Europe, right? If they said to the Israelis, okay, if you kill another kid, we will sanction you. This is the red line.
Yeah.
Would it make the Israelis think twice? Maybe it would. And I'm not saying this is going to happen, but I'm saying, and we'll leave it here, John, is the only thing we know about crises is that positions shift very, very quickly.
Yeah.
And what was regarded as extreme yesterday is mainstream today. And what used to be mainstream today is regarded as redundant tomorrow. And we move on. And the issue of sanctions is no different to the issue of everything else. Something you imagine would never have been possible suddenly becomes plausible, and before you know it, it's reality.